Most people struggle with complex, brain-dead technology that makes them feel frustrated and overwhelmed in their daily lives. Apple solved this chain of pain by obsessing over simplicity and elegant design to create tools that feel vital, alive, and intuitive for everyone. At Apple, the first 50 years, David Pogue reviews the epic tale of creative rebellion and all-nighters that transformed a nearly bankrupt startup into a global powerhouse. Discover the shocking secrets behind your favorite devices, from why the original iPhone almost didn't have a glass screen to the human drama that nearly destroyed the company. Listen to this fascinating journey through 5 decades of innovation to see how one company changed not just the devices we use, but how we communicate and create.
Welcome to the deep dive. It is incredibly exciting to be jumping into this material today.
Yeah, we are really looking at a truly sweeping narrative here.
Right, meticulously tracked across 5 distinct eras of a company that has, it's fundamentally altered human behavior.
Absolutely. And today's journey, it isn't just about circuit boards.
No, not at all.
It's about how the devices in your pocket right now or on your desk actually came to be. We're going to give you a comprehensive roadmap to understanding the most valuable company in the world.
Exactly. We'll trace that initial spark of the startup phase and then navigate those really dark, chaotic interregnum years.
The dark years, yeah.
And then explore the astonishing turnaround and finally break down this modern era of just pure operational dominance.
You know, to really appreciate the journey, you have to first look at the destination. We just have to take a second to marvel at the sheer mind-bending scale of Apple in 2026.
The numbers they're almost hard to comprehend.
They really are. We are talking about a modern behemoth generating nearly $400 billion a year in revenue.
Right.
To put that into perspective, that's making $1 million every 90 seconds.
Every minute and a half.
Every minute and a half, another million just drops into the bank. It's generating more revenue than Meta, Netflix, and Intel combined. It's a scale of wealth generation that eclipses the gross domestic product of many developed nations.
What's really fascinating here, though, is how that financial scale translates to human scale. Because today, Apple has 2.2 billion active users.
Which is insane.
It is. That is 27% of the entire global population. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to start thinking of Apple less as a traditional corporation and more as a sovereign entity.
Like a country.
Exactly. With 2.2 billion citizens, Apple is effectively the most populous country in the world. It's significantly larger than the populations of India or China.
That really changes how you look at them.
It does, because you are not just buying a piece of consumer electronics anymore. You're emigrating to a digital nation. You're agreeing to its laws. You're living within its borders. And honestly, you're paying its taxes in the form of subscription fees and app store cuts.
The digital nation concept is super strong, but it also implies a level of captive dependency,
Yeah, definitely.
But when you have 2.2 billion users locked into an ecosystem, at what point does that seamless experience turn into a walled garden? Because for a country this famous and this populated, there are so many foundational myths that everyone just assumes are true.
Oh, absolutely. The source material just shatters them.
It really is a joyride of eyebrow raisers that challenge what you think you know.
Yeah.
First off, Apple didn't actually start in a garage.
Right, that classic Silicon Valley trope.
Yeah, total trope. But it was actually the 4th business venture for the 2 founders and Steve Jobs. He was not the first CEO.
Or the second.
Or the 3rd. He was even 4th. Also, Jobs didn't even originate or name the Macintosh project.
People always assume he did.
Always.
Yeah.
And if you think the iPhone paved the way for the iPad, nope, the tablet actually came before the phone.
Which is still wild to think about.
Oh, and my absolute favorite one. The widely mocked absolute punchline of a product, the Newton. It actually played a crucial role in saving the company.
It really forces you to question that highly polished mythology we've all been handed over the years. But despite all those surprises, despite the fact that they've had 5 different CEOs, 3 completely different logos, and 4 different headquarters over the last half century, this analysis reveals incredibly strong corporate through lines.
Right. The DNA stays the same.
Exactly. The core DNA of Apple remains inextricably tied to Steve Jobs' original philosophies. We're going to see, over and over again, this ruthless dedication to simplicity, an obsession with elegant design, intense corporate secrecy, and a philosophy they call making the whole widget.
Making the whole widget, that's a huge one.
It's critical. It means controlling both the hardware and the software to ensure an absolutely seamless experience for you, the user. They don't want to rely on anyone else's code or anyone else's silicon if they don't absolutely have to.
Which makes perfect sense when you look at how it all began with the two Steves. And honestly, you couldn't write two more contrasting characters if you tried.
Night and day.
Completely.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have Steve Wozniak, or was. He's this brilliant, prank-loving engineering prodigy. When you look at his early years, his genius was almost entirely focused on subversion.
Yeah, he loved a good hack.
He did. Take his college days, for example. He built this tiny remote control TV jammer.
This story is amazing.
It is. He'd sit in the student lounge, secretly making the TV go fuzzy. People would get up, hit the side of the TV, adjust the antenna, and he'd time the static to make them think their weird physical contortions were fixing the picture.
Just messing with them.
Completely.
Yeah.
Eventually, he had people believing the TV only worked if someone stood on a chair with their hand pressed against the middle of the screen. He was essentially weaponizing radio frequency emissions for pure physical comedy.
It perfectly illustrates his genius, right? Electronics applied to pure playful subversion.
Yeah.
There was also his Pan Am International desk fake-out. He acquired a phone number that was exactly one digit off from the airline. And he would answer calls, posing as an agent, telling people they could fly freight, but they had to wear warm clothing because the cargo hold was unheated.
Just brilliant.
And a bit more dangerously, building a ticking electronic metronome bomb hoax in high school. That one ended with the principal literally running out to the athletic field, clutching the device to his chest to save the school.
That is insane.
Was lived to see how systems could be manipulated.
Incredible. So that's Was, the ultimate hacker prankster. Then you have Steve Jobs, the driven, disruptive loner.
The hustler.
The ultimate hustler. The kid who, at 12 years old, needed spare parts for a frequency counter, so he just picks up the phone and cold calls Bill Hewlett, the CEO of Hewlett-Packard.
Just a 12-year-old cold calling a CEO.
Exactly. And not only does he get the parts, he gets a summer job putting in screws on the assembly line.
The audacity is just built in.
It really was. He eventually goes to Reed College, drops out after a few months because he didn't want to waste his adoptive parents' life savings. But he stays on campus, sleeping on floors, just to audit classes he found visually or intellectually interesting.
Right, the calligraphy class.
Yes. One of those was a calligraphy class. At the time, it seemed totally useless, but it would eventually dictate the fact that modern computers have beautiful, proportionally spaced typography rather than that blocky terminal text.
How these two completely different orbits collide is easily one of the most important moments in tech history, and their first real collaboration acted as a profound catalyst.
It wasn't even a computer.
No, it was a blue box.
Right.
This was an illegal device that allowed users to hack the telephone network and make free, anonymous long-distance calls. To understand why this matters, you really have to understand the phone system of the 1970s.
It was basically run by sound, right?
Exactly. It was entirely controlled by audio frequencies. If you played a specific tone, specifically a 2600 hertz tone, the system would think a trunk line was empty and grant you access to route your own calls anywhere in the world.
Right, but I mean, other people were building blue boxes at the time. Phreakers had been doing this. What made the Was-Jobs collaboration so special?
It was the engineering. Was used a quartz crystal oscillator. For the non-engineers listening, older blue boxes used cheaper, analog components that would drift out of tune based on temperature or battery life.
Oh, so they weren't reliable.
Exactly. If the pitch drifted even slightly, the phone company's computers wouldn't recognize the fake tones, and the call would fail or even get flagged. The quartz crystal, however, guaranteed absolute perfect pitch every single time.
Wow.
It made Was's device virtually undetectable and infinitely reliable. He designed this incredibly elegant, compact digital circuitry. But here is the major divergence in their personalities.
Right. Was just wanted to prank people.
He just wanted to use it to prank, dial-a-joke lines around the world. But Jobs looked at this perfectly engineered device and didn't just see a prank. He saw a product.
He saw a business.
Yeah.
Jobs figures out how to package it, market it, and sell it door to door in college dorms for $150 a pop. The blue box proved the magic of their dynamic.
It was a blueprint.
Completely. Was designs the brilliant, elegant internal circuitry, and Jobs figures out how to make people want it, pay for it, and understand its value, which perfectly sets the stage for the actual birth of the Apple I.
Exactly. To understand this leap, picture the Homebrew Computer Club in 1975.
The ultimate nerd gathering.
It really was. This gathering in Menlo Park of scruffy hobbyists, counterculture hackers, and engineers who all wanted to democratize computing. At the time, computers were either room-sized corporate mainframes or expensive mini-computers that required you to physically flip toggle switches to program them in binary.
Which is just wild to think about now.
But at this club sees a demo of the Altair 8800, which used a single microprocessor chip. The light bulb goes off. He realizes he can design a computer that connects to a standard typewriter keyboard and outputs to a regular TV screen, something no one else was doing cheaply.
But the barrier to entry was the silicon itself, right? Microprocessor chips were crazy expensive.
Prohibitively expensive.
An Intel chip at the time was around $300, which is over $1,500 today. But Woz and a friend drive to a trade convention called WestCon and find a company called MOS Technology selling their 6502 microprocessor for $25. How on earth was MOS selling a chip that cheaply compared to Intel?
It basically came down to manufacturing yield rates and a vastly simplified architecture. The MOS 6502 didn't have all the complex instruction sets of the Intel chips, but Woz realized he didn't need them.
You could work around it.
Right. His genius was in writing incredibly tight, efficient code and designing a board layout that squeezed every ounce of performance out of that cheap $25 chip. So he goes back to his cubicle at HP, works late nights, and builds a working circuit board.
And then he takes it back to the club.
He takes it to the Homebrew Club, and because he's Woz, he just wants to give his schematics away for free.
Because information wants to be free.
Exactly. He truly believed that.
And Jobs watches this happen. He sees people taking Woz's free schematics, but doing absolutely nothing with them, because manually wiring a board with hundreds of solder points is tedious and incredibly difficult.
Most people just gave up.
Right? So Jobs says, why don't we build and sell the printed circuit boards? The copper traces would already be etched. People would just have to solder the chips in.
But Woz was skeptical.
Very. It would cost them $1,600 just to get the master design printed. He didn't think they'd sell enough to even break even. But Jobs uses his persuasive power. He tells Woz, even if we lose our money, we'll have a company. For once in our lives, we'll have a company.
And so, Apple Computer Company is founded on April Fool's Day, 1976. Woz, Jobs, and a third founder named Ron Wayne.
Ron Wayne, the great tragicomedy of Apple.
It really is. Wayne was an older, experienced draftsman who actually drew the very first Apple logo.
Which didn't look anything like an app.
Not at all. It was this intricate, old-timey ink drawing of Isaac Newton sitting under a tree, completely different from the minimalist bitten Apple we know today. But Wayne had been burned in a previous slot machine business venture.
He was gun-shy.
He got really nervous about the personal financial liabilities of this chaotic startup. Under their partnership agreement, any debts incurred by Jobs could be seized from Wayne's personal assets.
Because Jobs was just a wild card at that point.
Exactly. So just 11 days after signing the founding documents, he bails. He sells his 10% stake back to them for $800.
$800. If he had held on to it, that 10% stake would be worth roughly $350 billion today.
It's hard to even process that number.
Just let that sink in. It is easily one of the most staggering financial what-ifs in human history. But with Wayne gone, the two Steves had to actually build the business. Jobs manages to secure an order from a local computer shop, the Byte Shop, for 50 fully assembled boards.
But the owner didn't want bare printed circuit boards.
Right, he wanted a finished product. But they need parts to build 50 computers, and they have exactly $0.
This is where Jobs uses what would later be called his reality distortion field.
Right.
He walks into an electronics part supplier and manages to convince them to hand over thousands of dollars in components on net 30 days credit.
And he didn't even know what that meant.
Jobs didn't even know standard accounting terminology at the time. He just intuitively understood that it meant he got the parts today and had exactly 30 days to build the computers, deliver them to the Byte Shop, get paid, and pay the supplier back before they sent the authorities after him.
So the clock is ticking loudly, and this leads to the famous origin story. But the truth actually corrects the myth here. It wasn't just the garage. They took over the entire Jobs family home to build these 50 Apple iBoards.
Every room in the house.
They were soldering in the kitchen, testing in the living room, storing parts in the bedroom. Jobs even paid his pregnant sister $1 a board to meticulously plug in components. It was a frantic, all-hands-on-deck assembly line just to beat that 30-day credit deadline.
But they meet the deadline, they sell the boards, and Apple is off to the races.
Yeah, they are.
This incredibly scrappy effort quickly evolves. They secure venture capital from Mike Markula, who brings adult supervision and real corporate structure.
Which they desperately needed.
Yeah. Desperately. They launch the Apple II, which, unlike the bare-board Apple I, comes in a sleek plastic case with built-in color graphics. The Apple II becomes an absolute phenomenon. It's a massive cash cow that basically funds the entire company for the next several years.
But rapid growth usually leads to growing pains.
It led to deep corporate struggles. As the company transitions into the 1980s, trying to build the successors, the Apple III and the Lisa, we see a company trying to force innovation from the top down, and it resulted in incredibly expensive, severely flawed products.
The Apple III was a notorious disaster. Jobs demanded it have no cooling fan because he thought fans were noisy and inelegant.
Which is a bold choice for a computer.
Yeah, a terrible choice. It resulted in the chips getting so hot they would literally pop out of their sockets from thermal expansion. People had to drop the computers a few inches onto their desks just to reseat the chips.
Just dropping your incredibly expensive computer to fix it.
Exactly. But while the corporate side is stumbling, you have this rebellious, brilliant team working in a separate building on a new, highly secret project, the Macintosh. And the culture of this team was wild. It was a true creative rebellion.
Jobs had been pushed off the Lisa project, so he basically hijacked the Macintosh team.
He took it over?
He did. He didn't want them to think like traditional corporate engineers. He wanted them to think like artists. He famously called computers a bicycle for the mind.
I love that quote.
It's brilliant. He referenced a Scientific American study showing that while a human is relatively inefficient at locomotion compared to a condor, a human on a bicycle blows away every species on Earth in efficiency.
Right.
He wanted the Mac to be that bicycle, a tool to vastly amplify human creativity.
Yeah.
He was so committed to this artistic environment that he actually installed an $80,000 Bosendorfer piano in the lobby for the engineers to play.
Just casual.
Right. And he took them on field trips to a Louis Comfort Tiffany stained glass museum to show them how exquisite art could be mass-produced.
The team completely embraced that pirate mentality. There's this great story about an engineer named Burrell Smith. He was a low-paid service technician who managed to get brought onto the Mac team because he figured out a brilliant way to use memory chips.
But management wouldn't promote him.
Right. They wouldn't give him a promotion to full engineer. So he realizes his boss, Tom Whitney, subconsciously respects people with mustaches.
You can't make this up.
So Burrell spends a month growing a mustache, walks into the office, and boom, he gets promoted to full engineer that very afternoon.
It was a culture where you hacked the corporate system as much as you hacked the silicon.
But this intense, mission-driven environment had a severely dark side. Jobs' extreme volatility during this period is really well documented.
Yeah, it wasn't all just fun and pranks.
Not at all. Guy Kawasaki, who worked there at the time, described Jobs as a mission-driven asshole. If you got in the way of making the greatest computer in the world, he would run you over, back up, and run you over again.
He demanded absolute perfection. He would look at a circuit board that no customer would ever see and demand it be redesigned because the lines of solder weren't aesthetically pleasing. He was incredibly tough on people, quick to tears and quick to rage.
And that volatility is crucial to understanding the first major fracture in Apple's history. Most of our listeners know the legend of the 1985 boardroom coup where Jobs was ousted. But what is often misunderstood is the financial reality that forced the board's hand.
Right, it wasn't just personality clashes.
Exactly. Jobs had recruited John Sculley, the president of Pepsi, to be CEO, famously asking him if he wanted to sell sugared water for the rest of his life or come with him and change the world. But their relationship completely deteriorates.
The Mac was a visionary product, introducing the graphical user interface and the mouse to the masses. But it was incredibly slow, it lacked software, and was priced way too high at almost $2,500. Sales plummeted after the initial launch.
And the Apple II was still paying the bills.
That was the brutal reality inside Apple. The Apple II division, the older, unglamorous technology, was generating nearly all the company's revenue, while Jobs' Mac division was burning through cash and getting all the press.
Which created a massive rift.
Exactly. Jobs' disruptive management style, combined with the financial sinkhole the Mac had temporarily become, clashed fatally with Sculley's mandate to keep the company profitable. This culminates in a massive boardroom showdown in the summer of 1985.
And the board sides with Sculley.
They do, leading to Jobs being entirely stripped of his operational power. Devastated and furious, Jobs resigns from the company he founded.
So Jobs is out. The architect of the Mac is gone. And you have to wonder what happens to a company whose entire identity is wrapped up in one visionary when that visionary is suddenly removed.
That brings us to John Sculley's era and the dark years.
Part 2, the interregnum. If you look at the late 80s and early 90s, initially, John Sculley actually does well on paper. He milks the high margins of the Mac and grows revenues significantly. But the visionary edge, it's completely gone.
Sculley tries to compensate for the lack of a true product visionary by projecting a vision of the future. He commissions a concept video for something called the Knowledge Navigator.
Oh man, the Knowledge Navigator.
It is a perfect symbol of this era. It was a slickly produced video showing a professor using a futuristic flat-screen tablet with touch capability, voice control, and a bow-tied AI digital assistant that could search databases and manage calendars.
I mean, it predicted the iPad and Siri beautifully.
It did, but it was pure vaporware. Apple simply didn't have the underlying technology, the engineering focus, or the leadership to actually build it.
Instead of focused execution, Apple lost its way. It resulted in a confusing archipelago of products. They were just throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick.
Just a mess of hardware.
Complete mess. They released the Paladin, which was a bizarre Frankenstein device combining a Mac, a fax machine, and a telephone handset.
Who asked for that?
Nobody. There was the Power CD, which is basically a standalone CD player that looked like a sleek gray clam and had terrible battery life. And of course, the Newton, the early personal digital assistant.
The Newton is widely remembered as a punchline because its early handwriting recognition software was famously terrible, parodied everywhere from The Simpsons to Doonesbury.
Eat up Martha instead of beat up Martin.
Exactly. But dismissing it as a failure misses a critical technological pivot. To make a handheld device like the Newton work, Apple needed a processor that was powerful but drew very little battery power.
Because Intel chips would just melt the thing.
Intel's complex processors ran way too hot and needed massive batteries. So Apple invested heavily in a British company called Advanced RISC Machines, or ARM.
ARM. That's the architecture that essentially powers the entire modern mobile world today.
Exactly. ARM utilized RISC architecture to reduce instruction set computing. By simplifying the instructions the chip had to process, it required dramatically less power.
Which is brilliant for mobile.
It's foundational. While the Newton itself eventually died, Apple's investment in ARM architecture quietly became one of the most valuable assets in the company's portfolio. Decades later, ARM processors would be the beating heart of every single iPhone, iPad, and eventually every modern Mac.
However, in the short term of the mid-90s, the Newton and the rest of the unfocused product line initiated a corporate death spiral.
The beleaguered Apple era.
Yeah, that phrase was in every news article. This is under the CEOs who followed Sculley, Michael Spindler, and then Gil Amelio. Market share is absolutely crashing. Microsoft releases Windows 95, which basically clones the Mac interface but runs on much cheaper hardware.
Apple is losing the war to Microsoft and Intel PCs.
Big time. Massive, painful layoffs are happening round after round. The morale was so incredibly dark that an Apple engineer actually created a screensaver showing the names of fired employees scrolling down the screen and called it Spindler's List.
That is some bleak corporate humor.
It is so dark. But it was a symptom of a fundamentally broken organization. The company had devolved into warring internal fiefdoms. A perfect encapsulation of this dysfunction is the software nightmare users faced.
The OS updates.
Yes. If you were an Apple customer trying to update your Mac's operating system, you went to the website and had to choose between downloading System 7.5.3 or System 7.5 version 7.5.3.
Which is ridiculous.
They were exactly the same software code.
Yes.
But because different departments weren't talking to each other and there was no unified leadership, no one caught the redundancy. By the mid-90s, the company was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. Quality control plummeted. Macs were literally catching fire.
At one point, Apple was less than 6 weeks away from total bankruptcy.
6 weeks. Apple was almost completely dead. And the core of the rot was their operating system. The original Mac OS from 1984 had been patched and updated for a decade, and the code was a complete mess.
It was held together with duct tape.
It really was. It had no protected memory. That means if one single application crashed, the entire computer would freeze, and you'd have to physically restart the machine, losing all your work.
Apple knew they needed a modern operating system. They spent years trying to build a stable new OS internally, a project codenamed Copland. It was meant to have a microkernel and preemptive multitasking.
But it failed.
Copland became an absolute unmitigated disaster. Feature creep, endless delays, and internal politics resulted in a system that was barely functional enough to even demo. They finally realized the brutal truth. Apple's engineers couldn't build it. They had to buy a fully functioning operating system from the outside.
So Apple goes shopping. The industry assumed they were going to buy BIOS, an operating system built by Jean-Louis Gasset, a former Apple executive. But Gasset overplayed his hand and demanded way too much money.
So Apple looks at another option.
A company called NXT. And guess who owns NXT? Steve Jobs.
It is one of the most dramatic twists in corporate history. After being ousted from Apple, Jobs had founded NXT to build high-end workstations for higher education. The hardware ultimately failed on the market, but the operating system NXT step was years ahead of its time.
It was incredibly advanced.
It was built on a rock-solid UNIX foundation and featured object-oriented programming. That allowed developers to build complex applications incredibly fast by just snapping together pre-written chunks of code. Apple, on the brink of death, acquires NXT for its advanced operating system.
And in doing so, they inadvertently bring their exiled founder back through the side door.
The Trojan horse maneuver. And it's crucial to understand that the Steve Jobs who returns to Apple in late 1996 is not the same 30-year-old who left in 1985.
Right, this is Steve 2.0.
He's been humbled. He's learned how to manage creative talent by running Pixar, turning it into an animation powerhouse with Toy Story. He eventually pushes out CEO Gil Amelio and accepts the title of ICEO, interim CEO.
His first act upon returning was a masterclass in brutal focus. He looked at Apple's confusing, bloated product line. They were selling 15 sprawling, overlapping Mac models, often with confusing names like Performa 6320 CD.
Retailers didn't know which to stock, and consumers definitely didn't know which to buy.
Exactly. The supply chain implications of maintaining parts and inventory for 15 different models were bleeding the company dry. Jobs calls a massive meeting, draws a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard, and writes consumer and pro across the top, and desktop and portable down the side.
4 quadrants.
4 products. That's it. He killed everything else.
It looks reckless from the outside. They were already bleeding cash, and he just killed 75% of their product lines, including the Newton and all their printer divisions. But Jobs realized that shrinking the company was the only way to save it.
He had to stop the hemorrhaging.
Right. But fixing the product line wasn't enough. He had to fix the culture and the brand's perception. He needed to remind everyone why Apple mattered.
This led to the iconic Think Different ad campaign. What's fascinating here is this wasn't an ad about processor speeds, megabytes, or even computers. It featured black and white footage of historical rebels, Einstein, Gandhi, Picasso, Ali.
Jobs was speaking directly to the employees and the core loyalists.
He wanted to restore the soul of the company. He wanted to signal that Apple still had that rebellious, creative fire, and that the people who were crazy enough to think they could change the world were the ones who actually do.
And that fire manifested in the very first major product of the Steve 2.0 era, the iMac. This is where we are introduced to the profound historical partnership between Jobs and a young, brilliant British industrial designer named Jony Ive.
The original Bondi Blue iMac was unlike any computer anyone had ever seen.
In a sea of beige, rectangular plastic boxes, the iMac was teardrop-shaped. It was translucent, it was colorful, it looked like it belonged on the Jetsons.
It completely eliminated the floppy disk drive in favor of USB, which infuriated people at first but forced the entire industry forward.
But there's one specific detail about the original iMac that perfectly encapsulates their design philosophy. The handle on the back.
Right. Why a handle on a desktop computer?
Exactly. It was a 35-pound desktop computer. It wasn't meant to be carried around like a laptop. The mechanical engineers fought bitterly against it. They argued it would cost a fortune to engineer the tooling and manufacture the reinforced plastic, and it served absolutely no practical purpose.
But Jobs and Ive absolutely insisted.
Why? Because a handle sends a psychological signal. It signals that you can grab it. It fundamentally altered the psychology of the device, ensuring it wouldn't feel intimidating to everyday users who were still deeply afraid of breaking computers. It made the machine subservient to the human.
That obsession with design sets off a chain reaction that leads to the mobile revolution. First, they released the iPod in 2001, 1,000 songs in your pocket. It completely changes the music industry and makes Apple highly profitable again.
But then, a few years later, Jobs and his executive team look at the horizon and realize a terrifying truth.
Cell phones are eventually going to be able to play music.
Exactly. When that happens, why would anyone carry a separate iPod? Cell phones were going to cannibalize Apple's biggest hit. If anyone is going to cannibalize Apple, Jobs decided it should be Apple. So they decide they have to make a phone.
The origin of the iPhone, however, is deeply surprising and speaks to how innovation actually happens at Apple. It didn't start as a phone project. It actually started as a tablet project.
Right, Duncan Kerr's demo.
Yeah, Apple designer named Duncan Kerr had built a rough, table-sized demo of a multi-touch projector system. Jobs saw how you could manipulate digital objects directly with your bare fingers, pinching, scrolling, zooming, without needing a mouse or a stylus.
He wanted to build an entirely new tablet computer using this.
But when the threat of music-playing cell phones became existential, Jobs made a strategic pivot. He took the highly secret multi-touch technology intended for the tablet and shrunk it down to a phone-sized device.
And they almost didn't build the hardware themselves. They actually partnered with Motorola initially.
The Roker.
They released a phone called the Roker, which was supposed to be the iTunes phone. It was such a clunky, disastrous user experience that Jobs was humiliated on stage trying to demonstrate it. That failure convinced him that Apple had to own the whole widget. They had to build the phone from scratch.
And building it required massive, last-minute supply chain gymnastics. Right up until a few weeks before the iPhone was set to mass manufacture, the screen was supposed to be made of hard plastic.
Which would have been a disaster.
Because Jobs was carrying a prototype in his pocket with his keys, and he noticed the plastic screen scratched entirely too easily. He walked into a meeting and demanded the screen be made of unscratchable glass.
The team panicked.
They scrambled to find a glass strong enough, eventually partnering with Corning to revive a dormant technology called Gorilla Glass, forcing a massive pivot in the manufacturing supply chain in a matter of weeks.
It perfectly illustrates his uncompromising standard for the user experience.
But as we move toward the final acts of Steve Jobs, the narrative takes a really poignant turn. Even as he was battling pancreatic cancer, even while recovering from a liver transplant, his drive never faltered.
A member of his team described him as a design-avert, meaning he didn't drain his energy by looking at new designs. He actually drew physical and mental energy from the process.
When he was too weak to come to the office, the design team would bring prototypes to his house.
They would watch his energy visibly surge as he touched the materials and critiqued the interfaces. He literally lived for the work.
During these final years, he launches the iPad in 2010, finally bringing that original multi-touch tablet vision to life. And in doing so, he makes an incredibly stubborn, highly controversial decision. He completely blocks Adobe Flash from working on the iPad and the iPhone.
At the time, Flash was the software that ran almost all web video and interactive graphics. Everyone said he was crazy, that he was breaking the internet for Apple users.
But he insisted Flash was a resource hog. It drained mobile batteries, required a mouse cursor to work properly, and was full of security flaws. Plus, frankly, it was a software layer Apple couldn't control.
And he was right. Because the iPhone and iPad became so popular, the whole web development industry eventually abandoned Flash and moved to Apple's preferred standard, HTML5.
It was his final, massive reality distortion field. He bent the entire internet to his will.
Which brings us to the most critical corporate transition in modern business history. Steve Jobs passes away in 2011, and we enter the Tim Cook era.
The immediate reaction from the outside world and Wall Street was sheer panic.
Tim Cook was known as a quiet, numbers-focused supply chain expert from Alabama. He was viewed as the polar opposite of the charismatic, design-obsessed, visionary Jobs.
Media doubt was deafening. The satirical newspaper The Onion literally ran the headline, "Apple unveils panicked man with no ideas."
It's so mean, but that really captures what everyone was thinking. How do you follow Steve Jobs? If you aren't a product guy, how do you run a company entirely built on visionary product?
But Cook didn't try to be Steve 2.0. He knew he couldn't outdesign Jobs. Instead, he leaned entirely into his true strength, operational genius.
To understand Tim Cook, you have to understand how he views inventory. Cook famously described inventory as dairy products.
Dairy products?
Yeah. If you leave a computer sitting on a shelf in a warehouse for a month, it spoils. Its value drops because a newer, faster chip is right around the corner. Before Cook took over operations, Apple had months of inventory sitting around. Cook reduced that to literally days.
He mastered global logistics.
For instance, instead of shipping Macs from China on cargo ships that took weeks, he bought up all available holiday air freight space. Not only did this get product to consumers faster, but it effectively starved competitors of shipping capacity during the busiest time of the year.
That is ruthless and brilliant. He also cornered the market on manufacturing equipment. When Apple needed a specific type of precise metal casing for their laptops, Cook bought thousands of CNC milling machines upfront,
He basically bought the entire global supply.
meaning competitors simply couldn't manufacture laptops that looked as good as Apple's because they physically couldn't get the machines to cut the metal.
Cook understood that Apple's scale had become so massive that visionary design had to be matched by flawless global execution. When Apple faced severe crises like the intense international scrutiny over harsh labor conditions and suicides at Foxconn manufacturing plants in China, or the disastrous, buggy launch of Apple Maps where people were being directed into lakes, Cook navigated them with calm, principled leadership.
He apologized publicly when necessary.
He restructured executive teams, opened up supply chains to independent audits, and fixed the underlying operational flaws. He built a fortress of efficiency around Jobs' design legacy.
And under Cook, Apple expanded wildly beyond just selling physical hardware. He pushed massive growth in services and wearables. Think about Apple Pay, Apple TV, plus iCloud subscriptions, Apple Music, and the massive revenue cuts from the App Store.
Apple's services division now generates over $100 billion a year.
If Apple Services were its own standalone company, it would be number 40 in the Fortune 500. It's bigger than Disney, bigger than Boeing.
And in terms of wearables, the Apple Watch represents the first major new product category developed entirely in the post-Jobs era. The development of the watch highlights a maturation of Apple's design philosophy into the realm of human physiology.
Like the Taptic engine.
Exactly. Consider the notification system. The engineering team realized that using a traditional cell phone's eccentric rotating mass vibration motor, that spinning, buzzing internal weight felt awful and intrusive when strapped directly against the skin of a human wrist. It was too blunt.
Yeah, nobody wants a tiny lawnmower revving up on their wrist during a quiet meeting.
Right. So they engineered an entirely new component called the Taptic engine. It's a linear actuator that moves back and forth in a straight line, delivering a refined, gentle tapping sensation. It can mimic the feeling of a heartbeat or a subtle tap on the shoulder.
It's that obsession with the microscopic, tactile details of the human experience that proves the design culture survived the transition of power.
Furthermore, Cook took Jobs' original philosophy of owning the whole widget to its absolute, ultimate logical conclusion with the transition to Apple Silicon. For decades, Apple had relied on partner companies like Motorola, IBM, and finally Intel to make the processor chips the brains of their computers.
This reliance caused endless, painful delays when Intel failed to deliver faster chips on time, causing Apple to miss product cycles.
Under Cook, Apple spent billions to quietly design and manufacture their own processors, expanding on that original ARM architecture they invested in for the Newton.
By breaking free from Intel, Apple achieved unprecedented leaps in performance. By putting the CPU, the graphics processing unit, and the unified memory all on one single system on a chip. The M-series chips, they achieved laptops with battery life that lasted over 20 hours while running faster than bulky, power-hungry desktop PCs.
They vertically integrated the company down to the atomic level.
And that complete control over the silicon is exactly how they are handling the newest frontier. Artificial intelligence, or as they have branded it, Apple Intelligence. While competitors like Microsoft and Google surged ahead with flashy, hallucination-prone AI chatbots that scraped the internet, Apple took its time.
They were cautious. They are integrating AI deeply, but quietly into the ecosystem. It's about practical utility like the cleanup tool that seamlessly removes background objects from photos, or a highly personalized Siri that actually understands the context of what's on your screen at that exact moment.
But the real technical marvel is how they handle the data. Apple has staked its modern reputation on user privacy. How do you process massively complex AI requests that require server farms without vacuuming up your users' personal data?
They developed something called private cloud compute.
Which is fascinating.
It's a fascinating technical bridge. Whenever possible, Apple Intelligence processes your request directly on your device using the neural engine built into your Apple Silicon chip. Your data never leaves your hand.
But what if it's too complex?
If a request is too complex and requires massive server power, the device cryptographically protects the data, sends it to an Apple server built with custom Apple Silicon, processes the request, and then instantly deletes the data. It is never stored, and Apple has no cryptographic key to access it.
So no one can see it.
Independent security researchers can mathematically verify that the servers are not retaining personal information. It reflects how the enduring values of the company continue to evolve to meet modern threats.
Speaking of those enduring values, Let's look at what has truly survived this full 50-year journey. First, simplicity. But it's changed, hasn't it? It's no longer just about removing a floppy drive or taking buttons off a mouse.
Today, simplicity is about the seamless integration of your entire digital life. It's the magic of how your Apple Watch automatically unlocks your Mac when you sit down. It's how you can copy a block of text on your iPhone and instantly paste it onto your iPad. It's an ecosystem simplicity.
And second, sustainability. Cook has driven the company toward massive environmental goals. Today, 25% of all materials Apple ships are fully recycled.
That includes 99% of the tungsten they use in their Taptic engines and massive amounts of recycled cobalt and aluminum.
They are literally designing robotic arms named Liam and Daisy to rip apart old iPhones so they can mine old electronics instead of mining the Earth.
It is operational efficiency applied to planetary resources.
It is an incredible evolution from two guys soldering circuit boards in a living room to a global powerhouse recycling rare earth metals on a massive scale.
As we wrap up this journey through the history of Apple, I want to leave you with a provocative thought about the future. We've talked extensively about how Steve Jobs set out to build a bicycle for the mind, a tool fundamentally designed to empower human creativity, productivity, and freedom.
Right.
Yet the profound paradox of Apple is that their ultimate crowning success, the iPhone, ushered in an entirely new reality. It created an era of continuous, inescapable connectivity. The seamless ecosystem they built paved the way for algorithmic social media polarization, digital addiction, and an always-on culture where the boundaries between work and life have evaporated.
It really makes you stop and think. How has your own daily life been completely rewired by Apple's 50-year pursuit of simplicity and elegant design? Have these beautifully crafted glass rectangles set you free, or they captured your attention? Are you using the tool, or is the tool using you? It leaves us with the ultimate ongoing Silicon Valley question that they're still wrestling with in Cupertino today. How would Steve do this? Thank you for watching us, Illy. Please like, share, subscribe, follow up in the next video.